I noticed the silence first. The usual rattle of the gate when the wind shifted was gone, replaced by an empty hush that felt wrong before I even understood why. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee cooling in my hands, staring at the place where the fence should have been. For a moment, my mind tried to correct the image, as if I'd blink and the boards would reappear. They didn't. The backyard opened up too wide, the boundary erased so cleanly it looked intentional. I set the mug down, too carefully. The fence hadn't been new. It leaned a little sure. The wood had faded into a soft gray over the years, but it had been there when I bought the house. It had survived winters, a bad storm that knocked down half the maple out front, and more than a few conversations with neighbors leaning over it to talk about nothing in particular. It felt earned. I stepped outside. The morning air was sharp, carrying the smell of cut grass from somewhere down the street. Where the fence had stood, there were clean post holes filled in with fresh dirt. Someone had been thorough, professional even. That was when the confusion settled into something heavier. By the time I reached the driveway, my phone was already in my hand. No missed calls, no warnings I could remember. I scrolled through old emails, half expecting to find something I'd ignored. A notice buried between newsletters and utility bills. Nothing obvious stood out. The Homeowners Association came to mind slowly, like a word you don't want to say out loud. I hadn't had many dealings with them, dues paid on time, lawns trimmed. I liked quiet, and I thought I'd kept things that way. The office was a small building near the entrance of the neighborhood, neutral colors. Big windows that showed just enough to feel open, but not enough to feel welcoming. I walked in with dirt still on my shoes and questions piling up faster than I could organize them. She was behind the desk when I arrived. Mid-30s maybe, hair pulled back neatly. Her expression was polite in a way that felt practiced. "Can I help you?" she asked. I told her my name, my address. Then I paused, realizing how strange it sounded to say it out loud. "My fence is gone." She didn't look surprised. She glanced at her screen, fingers moving lightly over the keyboard. The pause stretched just long enough to feel deliberate. "Yes," she said finally. "That would be correct." Something about the certainty in her voice unsettled me more than the missing fence itself. I waited for her to explain, to soften it somehow. Instead, she met my eyes calmly. "It didn't comply with our current guidelines." The words landed quietly, too quietly, and I realized this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding after all. The strangest part was how calm she looked while saying it, as if fences disappeared every day and people simply learned to live with the gaps. "I wasn't notified," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I had expected anger, maybe embarrassment. Instead, there was just a dull pressure behind my eyes, like I'd woken up too early. She nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. "A notice was sent," she replied. "Two, actually, one by email and one by post." I leaned on the counter, the cool surface grounding me. "When?" She turned the screen slightly, not enough for me to read, but enough to signal transparency. 6 weeks ago. And again 2 weeks after that. 6 weeks. I ran the timeline through my head, late nights, a short trip out of town. The usual pile of mail I told myself I'd sort later. It was possible, uncomfortably so, that I'd missed something. "Still, no one called," I said. "No one knocked on my door." She folded her hands. Her nails were short, clean. "We don't typically do that for exterior violations." Violation. The word felt heavy for something that had once just been wood and nails. I asked her to explain the rule. She did patiently. Height restrictions, approved materials, aesthetic consistency. The fence, she said, predated the most recent update. It had been grandfathered in for a time. That time apparently had ended. "And the removal?" I asked. "You didn't think that deserved a conversation?" Her expression shifted just slightly. Not defensive, careful. The removal was authorized after the compliance window passed. Authorized. Another word that made the situation feel less personal than it clearly was. I noticed then how quiet the office was, no ringing phones. No background chatter, just the faint hum of the air system and the distant sound of traffic outside. It felt like a place designed to absorb frustration without reacting to it. "What happens now?" I asked. She hesitated. It was brief, but it was there. "You can submit a request for a replacement fence," she said. "One that meets the guidelines. Once approved, you're free to install it at your own expense." At your own expense. I almost laughed, but the sound stayed stuck in my chest. I asked for her name. She told me. I won't repeat it here, but the way she said it, clear, direct, made me think she was used to being remembered for moments like this. As I turned to leave, she added something quietly, almost as an afterthought. "If you believe there was an error," she said, "you can file an appeal." Outside, the sun had climbed higher, warming the pavement. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring back toward my street, imagining the open yard waiting for me. An appeal meant paperwork, time, patience. I wasn't sure yet which of those I had the least of. The yard looked different when I returned, not just wider, but exposed in a way that made me uneasy. I walked the length of where the fence had been, tracing an invisible line with my eyes. The grass was slightly lighter there, as if it hadn't quite caught up with the rest of the lawn yet. I tried to imagine a new fence in its place, something uniform and approved, but the image felt hollow, like replacing a familiar voice with one that only sounded similar. I spent that afternoon going through drawers and folders I hadn't opened in years. Old receipts, manuals for appliances I no longer owned. I found birthday cards from people who drifted out of my life and warranties that expired long ago. What I didn't find were the notices she'd mentioned. By early evening, I sat at the dining table with my laptop open, scrolling through the HOA portal. The guidelines were all there, neatly organized. Diagrams, measurements, approved colors with names that sounded softer than the shades actually were. It wasn't that the rules were unclear, it was that they felt detached, written for a neighborhood that existed more on paper than in reality. I drafted the appeal slowly, too slowly. Every sentence felt like it needed to strike a balance between calm and conviction. I explained the fence's history, its condition, the lack of direct communication. I avoided emotion, even when it pressed against the back of my throat. Before submitting, I reread the section on timelines. Responses could take up to 30 days, 30 days without a boundary. That night I slept poorly. The yard light flicked on and off as shadows passed, and each time it did, I half expected to see someone standing where the fence used to be. No one ever was. The next morning, I found myself back at the HOA office without fully deciding to go. It was quieter than before. She was there again, reviewing a stack of papers. She looked up and recognized me immediately. "I submitted an appeal," I said, "but I wanted to understand something." She gestured for me to continue. "If the fence was grandfathered in," I asked, "why remove it now? Why not start with a conversation?" She leaned back slightly. This time the pause felt different, less procedural. "The board's been under pressure," she said carefully. "There's been a push for uniformity, complaints from newer residents." I waited. "Your fence was visible from the street," she added. "That made it easier." Easier, not fair, not right, just easier. I thanked her, though I wasn't sure why. As I left, I noticed her watching me go, her expression unreadable but not unkind. Back home, I stood at the edge of my property again. The open space no longer felt accidental. It felt deliberate, chosen by people who didn't have to live with the result. And I wondered how many other things in this neighborhood had been decided that way. A week passed before anything changed, and even then it wasn't official. It started with glances. I noticed them while watering the lawn, the slow turn of a head as someone walked by, the way conversations dipped when I stepped outside. No one said anything directly. They didn't need to. The missing fence had become a quiet signal, something that marked my house as slightly out of alignment with the rest of the street. One afternoon, I found a flyer tucked into my mailbox, not addressed, no name, just a general reminder about community standards and shared responsibility. It wasn't signed by anyone I recognized, but the logo at the bottom was familiar. I didn't throw it away right away. Instead, I sat on the porch steps and read it twice, listening to the distant hum of lawn mowers and the soft clink of a wind chime from a neighboring yard. Everything sounded normal. That was the unsettling part. That evening, an email arrived from the HOA office. Not a decision, just a confirmation that my appeal had been received and was under review. The language was polite, neutral, carefully empty. I replied with a brief acknowledgement and closed the laptop. The next time I saw her was at the edge of the neighborhood park. She was walking briskly, phone pressed to her ear, her expression focused. I almost didn't call out to her. Almost, when she noticed me, she ended the call quickly. "Hello," she said. There was a hint of surprise this time. "I wanted to ask you something," I said. "Off the record." She considered that. The path was empty except for us, the trees casting long shadows as the day tilted toward evening. "I can listen," she said. "I can't promise answers." "Do you think the rules make things better?" I asked. It wasn't the question I'd planned, but it was the one that came out. She exhaled slowly. "I think they make things simpler," she said, "for the board, for enforcement." "That's not the same thing," I said. "No," she agreed. And for the first time, there was no script in her voice. We stood there in silence for a moment. A jogger passed, nodded politely, moved on. The world continued, indifferent to fences and appeals. Before we parted, she told me the board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. My appeal would be discussed then. I wasn't required to attend, but I could submit an additional statement if I wanted. At home, I opened a blank document and stared at it for a long time. This time, I didn't write about the fence. I wrote about living there, about how boundaries weren't just about property lines, but about feeling settled, seen. When I finished, I didn't reread it. I sent it as it was. That night, the yard felt quieter than before, not empty, just waiting, and so was I. Thursday arrived without ceremony. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that softened edges and made time feel slower. I debated whether to attend the meeting in person. In the end, I didn't. I told myself it was practical, that my statement would speak for itself, but there was another reason I didn't name. I wasn't sure I wanted to sit in a room where my home was reduced to bullet points on an agenda. Instead, I stayed in the yard. I moved a chair to the spot where the fence gate had once been and sat there with a notebook on my lap, pretending to read. Every so often a car passed. A neighbor waved. Another didn't. I took note of both. The meeting started at 6. I knew because an email reminder buzzed on my phone, though I hadn't set it. Someone had. I turned the phone face down. Around 7, the wind picked up. It carried the smell of rain, though none fell. I imagined the board members around a table, papers spread out, my words printed in black and white. I wondered how they'd read them. Quickly, carefully, at all. Just after 8, my phone buzzed again. This time I picked it up. The message was short. The board had reviewed my appeal. A formal response would follow within 48 hours. No indication of which way it leaned. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, then set the phone aside. The next day, I found a temporary marker planted near the edge of my property. A small orange stake with a flag attached, fluttering slightly. I hadn't put it there. I guessed it marked where a compliant fence could go. I pulled it out of the ground and laid it on the porch. That afternoon, she stopped by. She didn't knock right away. She stood at the edge of the driveway, hands loosely clasped, as if deciding whether to cross an invisible line. When I noticed her, she raised a hand in a small wave. "I wanted to let you know," she said, "before you got the email." I waited. "The board won't require you to install a new fence immediately," she continued. "They've agreed to pause enforcement while they review some of the language." "That's it?" I asked. "For now," she said. "It's not a reversal." I nodded. It wasn't what I'd hoped for, but it wasn't nothing. "There were questions," she added, "about process, communication." I watched her carefully, and about whether consistency always means improvement. The rain finally came then, light and brief. We stood there as it fell, neither of us moving. When she left, the yard looked the same as it had that morning. Open, undefined, but something had shifted just enough to feel. I didn't rush to fill the space. Not yet. The first thing I noticed the following week was how often people stopped walking. Not fully. Just enough to glance into the yard before continuing on, their steps slowing as if they were reading something invisible. I became aware of myself in a new way, where I stood, how long I lingered outside, whether my presence felt like an invitation or a challenge. I started spending more time out there anyway, mornings mostly. I'd take my coffee to the back step and sit quietly, listening to the neighborhood wake up. Garbage trucks in the distance. A dog barking once, then settling. The open yard stopped feeling like a mistake and began to feel like a question. Midweek, another email arrived, this one longer, carefully worded. The board acknowledged procedural gaps in how the fence removal had been handled. They emphasized that standards still mattered, but so did clarity. My case, they said, would inform a review process going forward. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't dismissal either. I forwarded the email to her with a short note. "Thank you for letting me know in person." She replied later that evening, just 2 sentences. She appreciated the way I'd framed my statement. It had made the discussion quieter than usual. That word stuck with me. Quiet. Over the next few days, small things happened. A neighbor I barely knew asked how long I'd lived there. Another mentioned the fence in passing, not critically, just curiously. Someone else admitted they'd had a similar issue years ago and never bothered to contest it. None of it felt like a movement, just a series of moments lightly connected. One afternoon, I found her standing near the sidewalk again, this time with a clipboard. She smiled when she saw me. "They're drafting revised notices," she said. "Clearer timelines, more direct contact." "That's good," I said. She hesitated. "They're also reconsidering how grandfathered elements are addressed." I waited, letting the space stay open. "No promises," she added. "But your fence comes up more than you might expect." I looked out at the yard, at the stretch of grass that had become familiar in its own way. "I haven't decided what I'll do yet," I said. "If they approve a replacement." She nodded. "That makes sense." Before she left, she glanced back once more, not at me, but at the line where the fence had been. Her expression was thoughtful, almost distant. That evening, I marked the old boundary with a row of small stones. Nothing permanent, just enough to remind myself where things had once stood. As the light faded, the yard didn't feel unfinished anymore. It felt considered, and I had the sense that whatever came next wouldn't be decided all at once. The formal decision arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked into my inbox between a utility reminder and a grocery receipt. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I walked the yard again, following the line of stones I'd placed a few nights earlier. Dew clung to the grass, darkening my shoes at the edges. The boundary was subtle, almost imaginary, but my feet followed it without hesitation. Muscle memory, maybe, or habit. Either way, it was still there. When I finally sat down and opened the email, I read it slowly. Then once more, out loud. The board had completed its review. They acknowledged that the fence removal had followed existing guidelines, but conceded that communication had been insufficient. Going forward, they would require direct contact before any exterior removal. Phone call, door notice. A human step added back into the process. As for my property, enforcement remained paused. I could rebuild with an approved design if I chose. Or I could leave things as they were for now without penalty. I leaned back in the chair, surprised by the feeling that followed. Not relief, not victory, something closer to permission. Later that afternoon, she stopped by again. This time, she didn't bring a clipboard, just herself. "I wanted to see how you were doing with it," she said. "I'm still figuring that out," I replied honestly. She smiled faintly. "That seems fair." We talked longer than we ever had, about the neighborhood, about how often rules outlived the reasons they were written. She admitted she hadn't expected my appeal to land the way it did. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. "You didn't demand anything," she said. "You just described what it felt like." "That felt like enough," I said. She nodded, looking out across the open yard. "Sometimes that's harder to ignore." Before she left, she asked a question I hadn't expected. "If you do rebuild," she said, "will you keep it the same?" I thought about the warped board near the gate, the way the latch used to stick in winter, the familiar imperfections. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe not exactly." That evening, I sketched a few ideas on scrap paper. Lower, more open. Something that suggested a boundary without insisting on it. I didn't commit to any of them. I wasn't ready yet. As night settled in, the yard lights came on automatically. The open space glowed softly, unchanged and quietly intentional. For the first time since the fence disappeared, I didn't feel the urge to fix anything. I felt allowed to wait. And waiting, I realized, was its own kind of resolution, at least for now. Time began to stretch again, settling into something almost ordinary. Days passed without emails or notices. The absence of updates felt deliberate, as if the situation had been gently set down rather than abandoned. I found myself noticing other details instead. The way the light shifted across the yard in the late afternoon, how the open space made the house feel slightly larger, more exposed but also more honest. One morning, a neighbor I'd only ever exchanged nods with stopped at the edge of the stones. "Mind if I ask?" he said, gesturing toward the yard. "Are you planning to put it back?" "I'm not sure," I replied. He considered that, then shrugged. "Looks fine without it." That was all. He kept walking. The comment lingered longer than he did. Later that week, I saw her again, not in any official capacity. She was walking through the neighborhood without her usual brisk pace, jacket unbuttoned, phone tucked away. When she noticed me, she smiled more easily than before. "The revised notice drafts are done," she said as we walked a few steps together. "They're clearer, slower even." "That sounds like progress," I said. "It is," she agreed. "Quiet progress." We passed the spot where my fence had once met the side yard. She paused there, then spoke without looking at me. "You know," she said, "I didn't think something this small would change how I see my job." I waited. "I used to think enforcement was about keeping things from drifting," she continued. "Now I think it's about noticing when something already has." I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I didn't try. That evening, I removed the stones one by one and placed them in a small pile near the shed. The boundary didn't need marking anymore. Not for me. When the board's final summary arrived, it confirmed what I already knew. The pause would remain indefinite. The fence was no longer flagged as a priority concern. The language was neutral, but the effect was clear. I closed the message and stood by the window, watching the yard settle into dusk. Nothing had been restored, nothing had been won, and yet the space felt complete in a way it hadn't before. I understood then that the fence had been more than a structure. It had been a habit, a default. Its absence had forced attention, mine and others. And attention, once given, had a way of changing things, not loudly, just enough to matter. The quiet that followed didn't feel empty anymore. It felt settled. I realized this one afternoon when I caught myself explaining the situation to a friend on the phone and stopped halfway through. There was nothing new to add, no ongoing tension to report, just a description of how things were now and how normal that felt. The yard had become a place I lingered. I brought a small table outside and started eating lunch there when the weather allowed. Without the fence, the breeze moved differently. Sounds traveled farther. I could hear the rhythm of life on the street without being pulled into it. It felt like standing at the edge of a conversation rather than being shut out of one. A letter arrived later that week, not from the board but from her, handwritten, short. She thanked me again for how I'd handled things, said the updated procedures were officially adopted. Said some of the board members had been uncomfortable at first, but that discomfort had led to discussion instead of defensiveness. At the bottom, she added a line that felt less formal. You reminded us that rules don't replace awareness. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not with important documents, but with things I didn't want to lose. Over the next few weeks, I noticed changes elsewhere in the neighborhood, small ones. A conversation between two residents and a board member that took place on a sidewalk instead of behind a desk. A posted notice that included a phone number and an invitation to talk before acting. None of it was dramatic. It didn't need to be. One evening, as the sun dropped low, I stood at the edge of the property again. The line where the fence had once stood was almost invisible now, the grass fully grown in. I tried to remember exactly how tall the boards had been, how the shadows used to fall. The details were fading. I thought about rebuilding then, not because I felt pressured, but because I wanted to understand my own hesitation. The truth surprised me. The fence had once made me feel protected. Now the openness did that instead, not because everyone suddenly respected the space, but because I did. A few days later, I ran into her one last time near the mailboxes. She asked if I'd made a decision. I have, I said. She waited. I'm leaving it open, I told her. At least for now. She smiled, not the polite one, not the professional one, just a simple acknowledgement. That sounds right, she said. As she walked away, I watched the neighborhood move around us, unchanged and yet somehow different. Not improved, just more aware. And awareness, I was learning, didn't need fences to hold its shape. The seasons shifted almost without my noticing. What had started as a decision began to feel like a rhythm. The yard changed color, then texture. Leaves gathered where the fence line used to be, drifting there as if they still recognized the boundary. I let them sit longer than usual before raking. There was no edge demanding neatness. I found that I liked that. One afternoon, I came home to find a small sign staked near the sidewalk a few houses down. It announced an upcoming HOA walkthrough, framed as a listening visit. The wording made me pause. Not inspection, not review, listening. I didn't attend, but I watched from a distance as board members spoke with residents in pairs, not carrying clipboards so much as notebooks. Conversations lasted longer than I expected. Laughter surfaced once or twice. When they reached my house, they didn't stop. That felt intentional, too. Later, she emailed to say the walkthrough had gone well, fewer complaints than anticipated, more questions. Some resistance, of course, but also curiosity. "It's slower this way," she wrote, "but it feels sturdier." I understood what she meant. That evening, I moved a bench into the yard, placing it where the old gate had opened inward. Sitting there, I realized how often I'd rushed through that space before, entering, exiting, never lingering. The fence had guided movement without my noticing. Its absence invited stillness. I thought about the cost of replacing it, the time, the approval process. But mostly, I thought about whether I wanted to return to something just because it was familiar. A week later, I received one final message from the board. It wasn't about enforcement or compliance. It was a request for feedback on the revised process from someone who had experienced the old one. I responded thoughtfully, without urgency. When I finished, I didn't feel like I was closing a chapter. It felt more like setting something down gently and stepping back to see how it stood on its own. The yard remained open. The space held. And for the first time since the fence disappeared, I stopped thinking of it as something taken from me. It had become something I'd been given: time, attention, and a chance to decide what mattered without being rushed. As night settled in, I turned off the porch light and let the dark rest where the boundary once was. Nothing felt unfinished, just quietly ongoing. I didn't notice the absence anymore. That realization came unexpectedly while I was trimming the edge of the lawn one morning and found myself stopping at the old fence line without thinking. The motion ended where it always had, even though there was nothing there to stop it. My hands rested at my sides. The habit had outlasted the structure. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, then continued. The neighborhood felt steadier than it had in months. Not quieter, just less watchful. I saw more people lingering on sidewalks, conversations stretching without urgency. The rules hadn't vanished, but they seemed to sit further back, no longer the first thing anyone reached for. I received a final email from her near the end of the week. She was moving on from the role. Not abruptly, not dramatically. Just transitioning to something else. She didn't say where. "I wanted to let you know before it showed up as a name change," she wrote. "It felt right to say it directly." I read the message twice. I replied with something simple: that I hoped the next place valued how carefully she listened. That her steadiness had mattered more than she probably realized. Her response came later that night. "I think this neighborhood taught me that," she wrote. "Not the other way around." After that, there were no more updates, no meetings, no follow-ups. The situation had finished without formally ending, like many things do. One evening, I walked the property again, slowly this time, without tracing lines or imagining replacements. The grass was even, the ground firm. The space held its shape without effort. I thought about the fence as it had been, not with frustration, but with a kind of fond distance. It had done its job once. It simply wasn't needed anymore. As the light faded, a neighbor waved from across the street. I waved back. Neither of us commented on the yard. There was nothing left to explain. I went inside and closed the door gently, aware of how complete the day felt. Not resolved. Just settled, and that, I realized, was enough. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No trucks returned. No crews appeared with measuring tape or clipboards. The fence didn't come back overnight, and no one announced a final verdict that wrapped everything up neatly. Life in the neighborhood continued the way it usually does, slowly, unevenly, with small adjustments that only make sense in hindsight. I kept the yard open. Sometimes, when I stood at the window in the early morning, I could still picture the fence exactly as it had been. The way the boards caught the light, the faint creak when the gate swung closed, the sense of division it offered without ever being questioned. But the image felt distant now, like remembering an old routine you no longer follow. The space didn't feel like a loss anymore. It felt like a decision I was still allowed to make. Months passed. The revised procedures became normal. New notices appeared now and then, written more carefully, delivered more personally. I watched from a distance as conversations replaced assumptions. Not always smoothly, not always successfully, but with attention. That seemed to matter. One evening I sat on the bench near where the gate used to be, the air cooling as the sun lowered behind the houses across the street. The yard felt calm, not because it was empty, but because it was settled. Nothing was waiting to be corrected. I thought about how easily things could have gone differently, how quickly frustration could have turned into something louder, sharper, how tempting it would have been to demand a clear win. Instead, there had been space, time, listening on both sides. The rules hadn't disappeared, the association hadn't changed overnight. But something else had shifted, something quieter, harder to measure. A pause before action, a willingness to notice impact before enforcing intention. Respect doesn't announce itself when it arrives, it shows up in smaller ways. In conversations that happen before decisions, in choices that leave room instead of closing it off. As the light faded completely, I stood and went inside, leaving the yard just as it was. Open, undivided. Enough. Not everything needs to be rebuilt to be resolved. Sometimes the absence is the resolution.